Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca, and in today's video, I am going to show you how I pieced and quilted my new tree skirt. On Black Friday this year, we did a quilt shop hop with my friend Ian and Mary, and I knew during that trip that I wanted to get some fabric to make some custom stockings for my family. We've lost so many of our stockings, it's time to make some new ones. And I wanted to make a tree skirt that kind of coordinated with that. The very first quilt shop that we went to, the Quilter Studio in Fairfax, Virginia, I found this really cute Christmas vintage Mickey and Minnie print. My family loves all things vintage Disney, and so that just seemed to be the right fabric for us. I grabbed enough of it to make the body of all 5 of our stockings, and then at the second quilt shop we stopped at, the Scrappy Apple in Winchester, Virginia, Kelly, I believe that's the shop owner's name, had the June Taylor Quilt As You Go batting for a tree skirt. So I knew that's how I was going to make my tree skirt. I brought in the vintage Mickey and Minnie fabric, and I pulled some low volumes and some greens and some other reds that all coordinated with that Mickey print, and decided I was going to make a Bargello tree skirt. And so in today's video, I'm going to show you how I made the Bargello strips and how I did the Quilt As You Go method to build out the body of my tree skirt. Spoiler alert, I will not be covering the binding in this video. Just a couple of weeks ago, I uploaded a wonderful binding tutorial that you can reference to show how to bind this when it's all done. As you can see, I have all of my red and green fabrics already cut out, and now I'm going to start cutting out my low volumes. But before I do, I want to point out a couple of things. I don't know if you can tell in the camera, but this white is not a bright white like these two fabrics are. It's actually kind of more of a cream. I didn't pick up on that when I was at the quilt shop shopping for my low volumes, but I definitely see it now. I'm not going to worry about it. I bought this fabric with the intention of putting it in my tree skirt, so it's going in the tree skirt. I'm going to hope that this will just add to the scrappiness feel of it, and honestly, that tree skirt's going to be underneath a tree in a dimly lit room covered up by packages, so I bet nobody will really notice. Second thing is, when I was reading through the pattern, I did get a little confused when I was cutting my reds and greens. I thought, because I didn't read the pattern, that I needed to cut one of each size from each of my strips. And that's important to note because when I cut my strips, I cut 2.5-inch strips of each print. So I thought I had to cut one of each measurement out of each of those strips. That's not the case. You're cutting one of each of these sizes from the print. So I had 4 reds and 4 greens, which means I have 4 reds in this pile and 4 greens in this pile, one from each of those prints. When I cut my low volumes, we're going to double that. We're going to need 2 from each one of these piles. So to make things a little bit easier, I'm just going to create 4 stacks. And this way I can cut all 4 of these pieces at the same time. And if I cut them folded in half like I have here, I'm going to get 2 of each of these prints, and then I can just start stacking them up on my reds and greens and have my piles ready to go. Spoiler alert, you're going to cut the same sizes that you did from the red and the greens. So it'll be the same size as this. You get the picture. Let's get to cutting. this next part of the pattern is a little tricky because we want to make sure that we're arranging our fabrics in the right order so that we get that bargello effect. If we don't lay our fabrics out in the right order, then we're just going to end up with a scrappy tree skirt, which is totally fine, but not the look I'm going for here. I'll be honest with you, this part really gave me a bit of a headache, and so I had to find a different way to do it. As I was looking at the diagram for all 16 of the sections that we're going to build out for the tree skirt, I could obviously see that bargello effect, but I was having a hard time figuring out which of these fabrics were these fabrics, and then how did those fabrics translate to my fabrics, and it just got to be a little chaotic. So here's what I did. I've already built out sections 1, 2, and 3. I made piles for those, stacked them up nicely, and labeled them. So I'm just going to set those aside. What I did to make this easier for my brain is I gave every fabric a number. All of the reds started with R, and then I numbered them 1, 2, 3, and 4. Green started with G, and were numbered 1, 2, 3, 4. And whites started with W, and were numbered 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I took that image for each of those fabrics, found it on my sections paper, and wrote next to that little image what fabric it was. So for example, this red argyle that's on the pattern, I labeled it R1, and everywhere where I saw it on the Assemble Sections page, I wrote next to it R1. And then this is where the trick really came in for me. I figured out which of the fabrics, which of my red fabrics I wanted to be R1, R2, R3, R4, same thing for the green, same thing for the white. And I just taped or stapled a little scrap of that fabric over top of the image so that when I'm looking at R1, I really know I mean this fabric from my own pile. Once I have that done, then I can just look at the codes and stack up my fabric, starting with the biggest on the bottom and the smallest on the top, pulling from my little legend that I created over here. This is going to make it a whole lot easier to create all 16 sections. I'm going to take the time to stack all of those up so that I've got everything streamlined and it's easier to sew. And if this makes sense to your brain too, and you're working on this pattern, guess what? I've typed all this up for you and put it in the description box down below. Now that I have all of my little sections organized and clipped and ready to go, I have to sew these together. And if you look at the pattern instruction, we're sewing it so that the smallest piece is on top and the largest piece is on the bottom, and we should be making this pyramid type shape. All of the even sections, 2, 4, 6, 8, you get the picture, those seams need to be pressed down, and all of the odds, the seams will be pressed up towards the top. That's going to help us nest our seams when we get to the point where we're putting all of this together. You could alternatively just press everything open, and that would work as well. The reason why we need this kind of triangular shape is because the wedges on our tree skirt kind of look a little bit like a Dresden. They're narrow towards the inner circle and wider towards the outer portion of the circle. So we've got to keep that type of shape with our strips. To make sure that we're doing that, it's probably a good idea to find the center of all of our pieces. Let me show you what I'm going to do. This is section number 1. I'm going to take the little paper and the clip off. For each one of these that I'm going to join together, I'm going to fold it in half and line up those short edges, and then just kind of give a little finger crease right along that fabric so I can see an indent where the center of that fabric is. Then I'll pick up the next piece in my pile, which is the second piece down, and I'm going to find the center of that as well, the same way. Fold it in half, crease it with my fingernails, and now I've got the center of both of those fabrics identified. If I just lay them on top of one another, right sides together, making sure that those two finger creased areas are right on top of each other, I'll make sure that I'm lining everything up so that it's aligned to the center rather than the left or the right. Once all of my fabrics are aligned properly, I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew all the way along this at 1/4 of an inch. And I'm actually going to start right at the short edge at the top, which means I'm going to sew through only one layer of fabric for just a moment. That's fine by me. Go through the section where there's 2 layers, and then all the way off at the end. Now remember, because this is an odd numbered section, we're going to press that seam up towards the top. So I'm just going to push it over with my finger, and I'm going to repeat the process all the way down. Once all 9 pieces of my fabric are attached to one another, I want to come in with a hot dry iron and just get all of those seams to lay nice and flat. Not going to worry about starching or anything. Just going to put a hot dry iron on top of each of those seams that I finger pressed so that it lays a bit flatter than it was before. And then I want to make sure that I don't forget what section this is, because that's going to be important. So I'm going to put that label back on the top of this, and then I'll just set it aside and repeat the process with the other 15 wedges. Now that I have all of my Christmas themed wedding cakes made out of fabric, get it? Because it looks like a wedding cake. I'm ready to clean these up and put them onto the batting. Over here I have the pile of stuff that came in the package from June Taylor. I have some cotton batting, which has some blue lines on it, and we'll talk about all that in just a couple of minutes. My little label that tells me what that is, but these 2 things are kind of important. This is my tree skirt instructions, and don't worry, June Taylor has made a YouTube video, which I will link to in the description box down below in case you want to check that out. But this template is going to come in real handy. What we're going to do is take out one of our wedges. We're going to do this for all of them. And we're going to set the template on top of our little piece of fabric. As you can see, there's plenty of extra room all the way around. So there's enough room for error with the pattern from Shabby Fabrics. We're going to trim all the way around this with our rotary cutter, but before we cut, we want to make sure that these black lines are laying directly on the seams so that our seams will nest nicely when we put this on the batting. So we're going to do this for all 16, and then we'll get to doing the Quilt As You Go method. When I go to clean these up, I could absolutely just trace around this template and then come in with either a rotary cutter or scissors to clean it up, but that's not efficient, and I'd rather do the cutting instead of doing the drawing and then the cutting. This template is really pretty flimsy, and I don't trust my rotary cutting blade up against it. I'm pretty sure I will cut through the template plastic if I do that, so I need a straight edge. Enter Fallon's slide lock. I'm going to use this as a straight edge for my rotary cutter. I'm going to line up the edge of the slide lock with the edge of that plastic. And when I push down on this handle, it's going to distribute pressure evenly along this entire green, it's like a 1/2 inch piece of acrylic. And underneath, you can see these little silicone grippy dots come out and they'll hold the entire template in place. So it won't move. My ruler or straight edge won't move. I should get a nice even cut. So we're going to use this to be my straight edge while it's up against the edge of that template piece. Once I've cut through all of it, I'm going to move the slide lock up just a little bit and make sure that this edge is flush with the area that I cut before, and then just keep going. I am all about trying to find shortcuts and areas to streamline things. So while you can use Fallon's ruler or your own ruler to create a straight edge for your rotary cutter, you actually can cut the fabric with your rotary cutter if you go really, 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 really slow. Please don't cut your fingers. What I found you could do is put something heavy, like some pattern weights, on top of the template to kind of hold the template in place. So for purposes of this video, I'm going to put my cup of Wonder Clips. That's going to hold the template on the fabric, and then I'm just going to come through with my rotary cutter and I'm going to run it very slowly along that nice thin piece of template plastic. If this makes you nervous, you could always leave this here, trace, and then cut with scissors. I have all of my sections cleaned up and I didn't lose any fingers or any blood in the process. These sections are starting to look like Christmas trees, so I feel like we're getting closer to having this done. We want to get our batting and our backing, and I'll show you how to put all this together. Before we begin sewing, I want to make sure that you understand what you're looking at here. This batting has some blue marks on it, and there's a few things that you need to realize before you just start putting your pieces on it. First, the instructions want you to sew on the dotted dashed lines, and there's 3 areas where you're going to have to do that. First is this inner circle. You're going to stitch directly on that dotted dashed line. Second is this dotted dashed line between sections 16 and section 1. And third is this dotted dashed line all the way around the outer part of the circle. When we're sewing on those dotted dash lines, we want to make sure that our backing fabric is already laying down on the back side of the batting. So we should have our backing fabric laid on the table, wrong side up. And then on top of that, we're going to smooth out our batting, make sure that there's no twist, turns, or folds underneath. As you run your hand along the batting, you should be able to feel if there are, so just make sure that it's nice and flat. And then you're going to go through and stitch on those dotted dash lines. I'm going to start on the inner circle, and then I will work my way down here, and then I'll do the outer circle around the perimeter. It can be a little bit difficult to get all this bulk underneath your machine. So just kind of roll it up the best you can, stitch on the lines, and make sure to go nice and slowly. This is going to baste your batting to your backing, and according to the instructions, it's supposed to help with how we're going to trim this towards the end of the project. I started sewing this and I was doing it with a full 1/4 inch, which became a problem because the instructions want you to sew these onto your batting and your backing with a scant 1/4 inch. When I used that full 1/4 inch, what happens is it got exaggerated every section. So by the time I got to section 6 or so, this piece that I had just added was not hitting the blue line. And so when I went to put my new wedge on, there was no prior piece for it to attach to. So I ripped everything out and we're going to redo it. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to take the wedge that is numbered for the section that you are trying to fill. You're going to start with section number 1 and you're going to lay it perfectly inside of that section. These blue lines are actually not your stitching lines. They are your placement lines. So you want to make sure your fabric is touching those blue lines. Once section number 1 is placed in there, then I'm going to grab section number 2 and I'm going to make sure that it fills the space. It does. Perfect. I'm going to lay it on top of section number 1. Everywhere where I have a seam that should intersect or nest, you may want to pin. I think I'm going to kind of wing it because I'm not a big pinner and I don't want to mess with all of that. But you could go through and pin all of this. You're going to sew from up here all the way down to the bottom with a scant 1/4 inch. Curious what that's going to look like? Well, for me, it means that my edge of my fabric, when I'm sewing with a 1/4 inch, it is right up against the right side of my presser foot. In this case, I'm going to have the fabric a little bit more to the left of that position, probably by about 3 or 4 threads. I think this is the one project where if my seam allowance is too small, it's actually going to come out in my favor, because the only thing that's going to happen if my seam allowance is too small is there's going to be a bigger chunk of fabric for a wedge to adhere to. If my seam allowance is too big, I'm not going to have any fabric from the previous section for the next section to grab onto. So if I'm being honest, I'm probably doing more closer to like 1/8 inch seam allowance. I just want to make sure I have nothing stopping me from getting this put together. Once we have sewn wedge number 2 on, we're going to put our fingers in between those 2 pieces and just very gently push this over. Then you're going to use a pressing tool of your choice. Don't use heat yet. We want to save the hot iron until later. And we're going to come in and really make sure that that seam is nice and flat and fully open. If we did everything right, then our wedge should hit or go past that blue line for the section we just covered. And in this case, it did. So yay, I did that one right. We're going to repeat this process until we get all the way around and add section 16. I'm coming up on the last 2 sections here, and I've realized a trick that's kind of helping me, and I hope this will come out okay in the end. The first one is when I'm laying my wedges down, I'm just making sure that the top of the wedge is past that stitched line, that dotted line in the inner circle. If it doesn't touch the top of the blue line, I'm not worrying about it. The second thing is I'm making sure the bottom extends past that stitched line down at the bottom. And then the third thing I'm making sure happens is when I flip it over and I press it either with my finger or my pressing tool, I want to make sure that this fabric comes right at or just a couple threads beyond this blue line. Then when I grab my next wedge, I'm going to lay it down, again, making sure that the top wedge extends past that stitching line. I'm going to line it up with the raw edge from the previous section. And anywhere where the seams are supposed to nest, I can feel it with my fingers. So I'm not going to worry too much about the first one. I'll try to get it close, but if it's off a little bit, that's okay. Remember, this part is going to be way up under the tree. So if I'm off on the top, that's fine. I would rather have it more on down here where you're going to see it. Once you've secured all of your pieces, then you're going to want to flip it over and find that original stitching line that's between section 1 and section 16, and you're going to want to secure it again from the back. Now, the instructions say just to stitch right down on that line, but I found that my section 1 and section 16 weren't overlapping very much, and so I stitched about 1/8 of an inch on either side of that line. Now everything is secured, and we're ready to clean this up. So the instructions tell us that we're going to come in and trim. You can do this from the back side because you'll be able to see your stitching where that original circle was. You're going to trim just to the outside of the outer line and just to the left or the inside of that inner circle line. And then you're going to cut right down on that original stitching line in between sections 1 and 16. So here's our tree skirt. It is almost done. The only thing we have left to do is the binding. And this piece honestly intimidates me, but it's got to happen so that this can go under the tree. Just like that, we have our tree skirt all finished except for the binding. The instructions do tell us because this is a circular object, we're going to need to cut our binding strips on the 45-degree angle when we're creating them. But otherwise, you're just going to bind this just like you normally would. You just want to make sure that when you're preparing your strips, you're doing it on that 45-degree angle, which will give you the maximum amount of stretch to your binding as possible. If you've never prepared bias binding before, don't worry. You can pick some up from your local quilt shop. I know Joann's has tons of those packages for you. I have a wonderful video that I uploaded a few weeks ago on how to do all things binding. It didn't show you how to cut bias binding, but it did show you how to secure your binding to your project, so you can reference that for finishing your tree skirt. Thank you, friends, so much for sewing with me today, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye!